If you watched season 1 of The Crown, you might remember how Princess Margaret was denied the right to marry her love, Peter Townsend.
You will love others.
There were a lot of articles written afterwards about Margaret and Peter Townsend and the real story. But none of the articles mention a 2004 document that came out from Downing Street in 1955 related to this whole event that sheds a different light over what Margaret would or wouldn't have had to give up if she married Peter Townsend. Let's get into it. First, let's get one thing out of the way. Peter Townsend is fine as hell. That tousled hair, that angular jaw, that cable knit sweater, me, yow. I get it, Margaret, I get it. But here's the thing. When they met, Margaret was a teenager. Some place Margaret as 14 when they met, others place her at 17. Let's just go with 17. And there's a couple problems. Not only is Captain Peter Townsend a royal equerry for the king, Margaret's father, but he's also in his 30s and married with children. In 1954, Townsend is tasked with protecting Margaret during a 3-month trip to South Africa. The two obviously spent a lot of time together. Margaret says that is when she really fell for him. Now, was this true love or was this teenage lust? Because here's what I find really interesting about this situation, and there are some people that are going to say that I'm looking at this too much through a 21st century lens, but hear me out. There is not the normal power imbalance here that people would point to as this being predatory. Margaret ranks higher than Peter. Peter works for her father, tasked with protecting Margaret. But at the same time, Margaret is a naive, sheltered princess. And if Peter had tried to cover up the whole situation and Margaret was like, no, he likes me back, who are people going to believe? The older man or the young princess? There are other things about Peter that we will get into later. I personally find it disturbing to look at this as true love that was denied. I personally think that overlooks some factors, but there will be people that disagree. So in November of 1952, Peter divorces his wife. And it was only in February of 1952 that Margaret's father, King George, died. Elizabeth becomes queen and Peter stays on as her royal equerry. And so then it's kind of this Fordian, did you form an even deeper attachment to someone that reminded you of a father-like figure now that you don't have your father anymore? Because my argument is Margaret's one true love was her father. Recall, her father was not supposed to be king. That was supposed to be his older brother, Edward. He knew what it was like to be the spare. And so he showered Margaret with attention. He saw her for who she was. There are some that say that he spoiled her, but he loved her. He truly loved her. He was an advocate for her. So while his death impacted everyone, it certainly impacted Margaret. So in April of 1953, Peter proposes to Margaret. Slight problem. There's a little thing known as the 1772 Royal Marriages Act. And this required that a royal under the age of 25 had to get approval for marriage from the monarch and Parliament. Margaret's under the age of 25 and does not get approval from her sister, the Queen. And all of this is very hush-hush until Queen Elizabeth's coronation in June of 1953. And the big tell that there was something going on between Margaret and Peter was when Margaret flicked a piece of lint from Peter Townsend's jacket. A reporter saw this and it suggested familiarity. That was just not something you did. And they were off and running. Another clip from The Crown.
I have a country that is for me. Newspapers that sympathize with me.
That's true. Despite the times, a surprising number of people do support Princess Margaret and Peter Townsend. I'm going to get into this article later, but about 75% of the electorate, the government conceded, did support Peter and Margaret. To summarize so we can get to the good stuff, they try the old geographical fix and they send Peter Townsend over to Brussels as an heir attaché. Margaret turns 25 on August 21st, 1955. And this is obviously a big deal because now she can decide if she is going to marry him of her own accord. But is she willing to give up everything for love? The way some may say perhaps her uncle King Edward did. But I just think he was outplayed, but that is a video for another time. We get scenes like this from The Crown, reenacting all of this.
Best I can offer is to place a bill of renunciation before Parliament. It would deprive her of all her rights, privileges, and income. She would have to be married in a civil ceremony, abroad.
So the way The Crown and a lot of articles about Peter and Margaret portray it is that they forced her into the situation to give up her love. And that the government, her sister, denied her the love of her life. But let's talk about some info that came out in 2004. Secret deal would have let Princess keep royal title and income. So these state papers were released in 2004 as a part of the 50-year rule. Much of the correspondence was withheld, but we did get scraps. Glad we get to wait till Andrew's 105 to see his shiz. And these papers revealed some of the private negotiations that were frantically going on behind the scenes. The results of the negotiations show up in drafts of a letter by then Prime Minister Anthony Eden that would have been sent out to Commonwealth countries if Margaret had decided to go through with her decision to marry Peter. Here are some passages from it. Quote, United Kingdom ministers understand that it is Princess Margaret's wish that, despite her renunciation of her right to the succession, she should continue to live in the UK and to carry out her duties as a member of the royal family. In the Crown's version, Margaret would have had to live abroad with Peter for a couple of years. Back to the letter, quote, the UK government are, however, advised that neither her proposed marriage nor her renunciation of her rights to the succession need in themselves affect either her style and title as Her Royal Highness Princess Margaret or the provision made for her under the Civil List. The Civil List Act of 1952 provided that she should receive on her marriage a further sum of £9,000 a year in addition to the £6,000 a year which she has already, end quote. They would have had to have a quiet ceremony somewhere in London at a register office, that is true, not necessarily abroad. Eden hoped that, quote, this would meet the popular view that she should be allowed to marry the man she loves, end quote. The files also show that the Queen was prepared to reform the 1772 Act, which would have meant that Margaret could have pursued marriage without asking her sister's consent. There is more on the 1772 Act that we won't know about till 2057. Either way, on October 31st, 1955, Margaret makes the announcement that she and Peter Townsend will not be getting married. She says that she is mindful of the teachings of the church. And the reason there was newfound interest in this in 2004 was because Camilla and Charles were going to get married in 2005. And there were questions over what that would look like for the future king, and if there was any precedent to show what could happen. And these files at the National Archives of Kew about his Aunt Margaret would certainly help Charles's case. As for Peter, he marries a teenager. She's either 19 or 20 at the time, but they met when she was in her teens. She's a Belgian national. They marry and they have children. Fun fact, one of his daughters becomes a Ralph Lauren model. Again, he gives good face. I can't quite ship a couple where the man has a pattern of going after younger women even as he continues to get older. What's that Taylor Swift quote? I'll get older, but your lovers stay my age. There it is. Besides youth and beauty, what is he looking for in teenage girls? Again, I know it's a different time. Is it that he likes to feel like the worldly older man? Does he want a woman that will look up to him? A relationship where he is like the true adult? I don't know. But I think the whole forbidden love affair is less interesting than the truth. That perhaps the geographical distance coupled with some of the things that Margaret would have had to give up were enough for her to stop short of marrying Peter. Maybe it made her realize, however begrudgingly, that she didn't want to give up this family, this lifestyle. But again, the letters in the archives tell a different story than most articles and the Crown have painted about what happened between these two. And that is Peter and Margaret.